Just want to give a quick shout out to the homie Scrubbutt for hooking me up with this McDonald's merch. Pretty coincidental because today we're going to be talking about something pretty tasty, even tastier than McDonald's. Pretty tasty. Because I listen to every song released by the Tasty Network. Segue! Tasty Network and I go somewhat far back, just in the sense that I was semi-involved in the Tasty community in their Discord server. And I would say maybe back around 2018-19, my buddy Berryfruit was pretty into Tasty as well. They still are, but back then we were actually considering the logistics of mashing the entire Tasty discography back then. Obviously, to do so, you'd need to listen to the entire discography, which Berryfruit had done, and we compiled a ton of metadata. We've never ended up fulfilling that project, but it's always stayed in the back of my mind as a label that I was pretty interested in, that socially I was pretty involved in, and that eventually I would like to marathon. But as is somewhat implied, I've barely listened to any Tasty at all, for that matter. Aside from some of the biggest tracks that were released, such as Xenogenesis by TheFatRat, and a couple classics that I didn't even realize were Tasty releases until I ended up re-listening to them. But generally speaking, I was pretty uninformed about the Tasty landscape. My surface level interpretation and understanding of Tasty, or the Tasty Network, is that it was a label that signed quite a bit of house. And in hindsight, I think the lack of knowledge that I have on Tasty is pretty ironic, considering that I nowadays consider myself pretty friendly with the former community manager, now label manager, Gabriel. I know you're probably watching this, Gabriel. Hello. You should release the blue mascot guy as a plushie. I don't think many people would buy it, but I would. Tasty was actually established back in August of 2011. But when it comes to the actual label shenanigans and them releasing music, they actually didn't drop any music until basically December 2012, right at the very end, where they dropped Urban Contact's Sky Express. In the meantime, however, when they first started their music career on YouTube, they were much more known as a curator of music in the scene outside of the label. While most promotional channels on YouTube at the time were either promotional channels exclusively for other people's music or promotional channels for their own label's music, such as the Monstercats of the world, Tasty Network took on this unique approach where they not only promoted other people's music and very frequently, but also promoted the music of their own label. And over the course of their decade-plus existence online, they've gone by many names. I think most people know them as just Tasty, Tasty Records. I think legally speaking, as an entity, they are Tasty Network. And if you search for their accounts on SoundCloud, you also get Tasty Selection. But the one thing that has maintained consistency throughout all of this time is Tasty, which is slightly unfortunate because they are beat out just marginally in search engine optimization by another Tasty conglomerate, but we're not talking about that one. We're going to be talking about Tasty Network. But when it comes to the beginnings of their label releases, house is, I think, the best description of the main music that they were releasing. House, potentially electro house, and then slightly slower in tempo, perhaps a little bit of mid-tempo, and indie dance. That 110 to 130 BPM is where they really excelled at. And in their debut 2012-2013 year, we have a couple very classic names that we're familiar with nowadays, such as with F.O.O.L and Favorite, along with Urban Contact continuing to be a staple in the label. But what I find pretty entertaining myself is seeing the names in the Dead Cat Bounce remix EP, where we have Must Die and Dabbin. And man, you listen to those tracks, they don't sound like they were made by those artists. Dabbin, a little bit, but Must Die essentially made a garage track. Must Die, the one that makes like the craziest hardstyle music you know, made garage music like a decade ago. 2013, I think they focused a lot more in distributing packages of music, which is why, while their music was infrequent and oftentimes monthly or bi-monthly, and I mean that as in every other month, they would release an EP's worth of music, debuting 6 EPs, 1 double single, and 1 compilation, which back in 2013 was a massive compilation. And y'all will probably recall it when I mention the name, Spotlight Volume 1. The Spotlight compilation was this huge mega collaboration between a bunch of different labels, and the first compilation was a collaboration between the Tasty Network, EDM Spotlight, Trap and Bass, and Monstercat. While all 4 of those entities collaborated on the compilation, not all 4 of those entities signed all the music equally. I believe the full compilation came out to about like 20 tracks. But as for the music that was specifically signed under Tasty, were 5 tracks, that being Metronome by Chimeric, This Time by Favorite, The Takedown by Coda and Dabin, and Berserk by Lochnar, along with a re-released F.O.O.L track. I did want to highlight the EDM Spotlight compilation for one reason though, additionally because there was a 5th entity involved. Cannabalin. You see, we can't have a Dabin mention without Cannabalin, and the Coda and Dabin track, The Takedown, was a co-release between Tasty Network and Cannabalin on the EDM Spotlight, which was with Trap and Bass and Monster Cat. To bring it back to the quality of music, however, it's definitely what you would probably expect from decade-old EDM music, although I will say, as probably a testament to house music, that the quality has generally stood up. It definitely sounds aged, but there's some golden nuggets in there. I am going to highlight one more release, that being Urban Contact's Starburst EP. In particular because I am not sure if this was how it released or if this was changed later on in the lifespan, but currently it is actually also signed with Warner Music Germany. I highlight this because I didn't know that this was a Tasty release until I think I found on like Rate Your Music that this was an EP that exists at all. I didn't know that this was a Tasty release until I had finished and was doing some last minute preliminary research. But it includes another Urban Contact release along with I think like 5 remixes. And they don't exist anywhere online aside from YouTube re-uploads and a few SoundCloud uploads. It might be on Spotify as well, but I'd have to double check. 2014 is where they really started to hit the ground running and where we saw the now regular format of Tasty, that being the consistent releases of singles. Around this time, we started to see some more frequent names appear such as Anzo, TheFatRat, Delary, Rods, Mycool, and Prototype Raptor start to appear as names that would eventually make more appearances in the future. During 2014, however, I want to highlight one very important release, that being Straight Life by the Noisy Freaks. Let me tell you, if you only end up listening to one thing, one project from the Tasty Network, that LP has some incredible music. I wouldn't even say from like a technical aspect it's necessarily anything impressive, but it is a body of work that is so consistent, so clean, and released literally a decade ago in 2014. If the Noisy Freaks had come back to drop the exact same album again in 2025, I think this is a body of music that would still hold up to the modern standard. Definitely a couple songs that maybe wouldn't, but it is really good. I would personally give this a recommendation. 2015 saw a lot more of the same, that being a lot more singles, a lot more names, but in particular as well, the reintroduction of compilations, and this time a Tasty flagship compilation. I think the best way one could compare the compilations would be to the Monster Cat compilations, where they would release 30 songs and then re-release all the songs in a compilation to kind of recap everything. Tasty did similar. And I would say that generally with the continued releases of their house music, that quality that I have mentioned prior that I have spoken so highly of has also maintained consistency in that regard as well. They did, however, start to spread their wings into other genres. In particular, we started seeing a little bit of future bass, some dubstep, and some drum and bass. But house music and electro music definitely took the forefront in the release schedule. Entering 2017, however, is where things kind of start to slow down just a little bit. 2013 and 2014 saw about 40 songs released in that year, and 2015 and 2016 really ramped it up with averaging around 60 to 70 songs dropped each year. Where 2017 starts to make a turn, and I think this might be a bit of a controversial comparison, is where I've really begun to see a number of comparisons to Elysian Records, which is another record label that I have marathoned in the past. I say that because Tasty Network, at least as an outsider, has always struck out to me as a label that was focused on house and electro music. And over the years, they started trying to sign other music that treaded out of those genre boundaries. And while I think that was really cool, I think one of the biggest problems was that some of the other genres that they were trying to sign, while potentially popular, was just not as defined and still evolving compared to electro, which was a very established and consistent genre to produce very high quality of. I would say there's a bit of a U-graph in that regards, where Some of the oldest music on Tasty has held up very well, and obviously all of the new music is very well made. But then we've got this weird middle zone where, because a lot of artists were treading away from electro and experimenting with new genres, and they were signing in new artists that were producing other genres, you have this gray zone of music that just did not quite age as well. Something else that also struck out to me as very surprising is that while at the beginning, when Tasty was starting off, albums and EPs were an established forefront release format, they essentially sidelined it for the preferred single format. And I imagine getting a bunch of people to release one song is a lot easier than getting a few people to make entire 4-5 track EPs. And generally speaking, I don't really have a preference if a label releases albums more than singles. But the reason I did want to highlight that is because while I've kept on having this preconceived notion that Tasty is a house and electro label, the albums that they would release after the Noisy Freaks were oftentimes not electro. The second LP to release after the Noisy Freaks was Fiction by Shurk. And this is an LP, I can't even say sidelined me, it double sidelined me. I started listening to it and it was like chill out, but it was very ambient chill out, and it was also experimental. I never would have thought Tasty would have released anything like it. To that point though, it was an LP that was not for me. I did add a couple of those songs into my Tasty playlist, which I will be linking and talking more about later. But at the time, after listening to so much Tasty music, I thought potentially this was going to be a one-off. And you know what else I thought was going to be a one-off? This camera just randomly stopping recordings in the middle of my takes. Alright, it's a week later from now, so where did I leave off? I was under the anticipation that the Shurk LP was probably a one-off situation where they tried to be a little bit different and experimental. Maybe they were trying to introduce new music, and the only way they could do that was through this large grandiose event of it being released as an LP. It was completely different to every other release, as I had mentioned already. Their singles, their EPs, their compilations have all been curated to have a Tasty sound, the type of song that you would expect on Tasty. And following the Shurk's LP, that maintained to be true. All the future singles and EPs sounded like Tasty releases. Even the following LP afterwards, which was a Rod's LP, sounded like a Tasty release. It didn't sound like Rod's older stuff that they had released on Tasty, but it still sounded like a Tasty release. That is until 2018, where they released their fourth LP, that being Shurk's Into the Void LP, where once again I was quite blindsided by the style that was released. This time around I wasn't particularly as surprised, that being I think because similarly to the Rod's LP, Shurk had a couple of singles and even an EP on the label prior to this LP. So while I think I would call the Shurk LP experimental, although there were definitely electronic elements in it, while not as surprising and out of left field as the Shurk's LP, was still once again pretty different. It didn't sound to me like a Tasty release. This ended up happening again once more in 2021 with Law's Another Dimension LP. This time around though, I think they've definitely found the line that was in the middle. It was an LP where I could be like, okay, I could see that Tasty would release this, but on the other hand, they had never released music like the Law's LP. It was generally either like mid-tempo or dubstep or even one track that I think was hardcore, but the main characteristic in this LP is that it is extremely loud. When you compare it to the entire discography prior, loud is not an adjective that I would give to the music that is curated from the Tasty network. Since 2021, there has not been an LP. However, if we were to backtrack just a little bit, as I had mentioned, they did continue to release some singles and a couple EPs that were definitely more in line with what I would imagine a Tasty curated release would be. A couple shout outs I'll give would be the Murda's Synapse EP, which I'm obligated to mention because it has a red panda in it, Fool's Highway EP, Last Island Sustain EP, AV's High Performance EP, and Mike Cool's Recall EP. After backtracking, however, I do want to fast forward really quickly to 2023 because if we're going to be talking about EPs, we have to talk about 2023, that being the twilight years of Tasty Network. Over the course of my many years of marathoning discographies, the Tasty Network is the first discography that I've ever marathoned that had a gap year. And in this case, it wasn't even 1 year, but 2.5 years, essentially. At the end of August of 2021, The Forgotten dropped a remix EP for their track Dreams. And for 2 whole years, Tasty proceeded to not release a single track at all. 2022 passed by, no songs. 2023 came by, however, and in August of that year, they dropped an EP with an alias that I will assume is pronounced Alive. They dropped a 4-track EP, which when I listened to it, both caught me very off guard, but also sounded like a Tasty EP. It was pretty good. I liked it. It was very well produced. After almost 2 years of radio silence, it seemed like they were coming out of the slumber. And then they proceeded to not release anything for another 6 months. While we're on the topic on the amount of songs that Tasty had released over the years, one of the biggest things that I had noticed during my marathon is while the discography is 332 songs, this label in particular, I definitely noticed that once you started listening to the music, it was a very slow journey getting through the discography. But then on the flip side of things, once you got through the first couple of years, it was almost like the discography marathon started speeding up. In 2012, they released 1 song and 1 song only, but going into 2013, they had released 41 songs, followed by 36, 66, 54, and going into 2017 was when we started to see the slowing down of releases. 23, 37, 14, 16, 14, and then 0. You could listen to almost 2/3 of the Tasty discography and you would still be in the first couple years of its lifespan. It isn't necessarily uncommon for labels to slow down once they had gone through their prime, or I would say during the difficulties of COVID, but definitely have not seen anything as extreme as this. I think it's really silly when a label will sometimes not release anything for like 3 months and people assume like, oh, the label's dead, it's over, it's long gone. But 2.5 years, that is quite a long time to be gone. And then we reached 2024. 2024 saw some semblance of a revival for the Tasty network. While 2024 brought in 20 songs and unfortunately not a consistent number of releases, it was still the most songs that they had released in almost 7 years. And generally speaking, I feel like for most collectives or labels, being gone that long could almost be a death sentence. There have been labels that have fallen off and didn't even stop releasing music. But looking at some of the artists that they had signed in their revival year, I was really captivated learning about Bad Disc and ADM, in particular because they have released on Mousetrap before. One of the most interesting artists, at least in my brief research, is what I'm going to assume is pronounced Red Devil. One of their releases in their discography has like 1.5 million streams from funk music. So shouts out to Tasty for the signing. While Tasty Network is admittedly a little rocky, and similarly to what I think I mentioned prior, I kept just drawing parallels between Tasty Network and Elysian Records. But where I think the two labels kind of differ from each other is the way that they ended up approaching the next steps of the label's journey. The decisions that Elysian Records have made are plentiful and could be its own video, but to quickly gloss over, they made a second label that completely flopped. They essentially shifted from releasing trap music into funk music exclusively, and while their arts back then weren't necessarily the most innovative, at least it was consistent, have now been completely replaced with AI, as opposed to Tasty where, well, okay, they did have a couple AI artworks, but they've stopped and at least have continued in the original direction that they had for their curation, which I think is very commendable. As for where Tasty will be in a few years from now, we will have to see. Into 2025, they have released 6 songs so far, and not consistently. Simulcats is one of them. Y'all better stream Chronophyll. But in the era where all of these record labels are being bought out and dying or ceasing operations, I think it's pretty refreshing to see Tasty Network kind of come back from the grave. And so while I don't see Tasty returning back to their prime, Gabriel, please don't unsign Chronophyll for that comment. I feel like there is a net positive in Tasty continuing their operations and releasing the music that they sign. And I would like to see that there is still a hole and a need that is being filled with Tasty continuing to release music. All right, let's get to the statistics. So as I had mentioned earlier, Tasty Network has released 332 songs. I'm gonna absolutely destroy all these upcoming pronunciations, so apologies in advance. But longest song, shouts out to City in My Eyes by Iobon and J.H. Anu featuring Ku Reed, coming in at 7 minutes and 24 seconds. With an honorable mention to Kashuk's Characters, the second track on the label to hit the 7-minute mark. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got Shurk and Then There Was Nothing, a 1 minute 26-second track, with an honorable mention to Murda and Poda for having tracks that were also sub 2 minutes. Regarding duration, Tasty Network is a very unique label as well compared to all of my past labels, where every other label that I have marathoned so far has had a track duration length averaging somewhere between 3 minutes and 3 minutes 59 seconds, that 3-minute bubble. Whereas with Tasty, the average length track is 4 minutes and 10 seconds, being the second label with a track average that is not in the 3-minute bubble. I say second label because the first one is Megarex, which I haven't made a video on, and I won't make a video for at least another year. So sorry. But in that case, Tasty Network gets the gold trophy in this regard for being the first label that I've published a video about. So shouts out. I think there's definitely a conversation to be had, especially with it pertaining to the house genre. If you listen to a lot of their older music, they have a ton of house music with very long intros and outros, especially with kick drum loops, generally speaking, so that DJs could easily transition into and out of music. Nowadays, most labels, and I'll use Night Mode for an example, will separate it from original mix and extended mixes, oftentimes inflating track counts and also inflating duration lengths, which what I found pretty interesting is that the Tasty Network has no extended mixes. All of the music that they have released are the original versions of the song. There are no alternate versions per se. They're just making their music long for the love of the game, which I think additionally lends credence to the earlier thing that I had mentioned, where the first couple of years of the Tasty Network's discography are the longest years. The songs are longer, the song quantity is much higher, and then once you get to like 2016, the years start coming and they just don't stop coming. In regards to track breakdown, there have been 211 releases, with 181 of them being singles, 5 of them being LPs, 20 of them being EPs, a singular double single, and 4 compilations. Where EPs and singles were kind of interspersed a bit more commonly, there has not been a single since I mentioned the twilight years of 2023. But even further back than that, the last compilation that had been released was back in 2016. I think it'd be fun to speculate if there will be a compilation to return in some format, or if that's just a, format of the past. I guess if they were to start releasing compilations again, they could either re-release every single single up until this point since 2016. And interestingly enough, I think it would only be like 60 or 70 songs, which is a lot, but it wouldn't be like, the 100 or 200 songs that people would probably expect from almost a decade of time passing. It would also probably introduce some complications, that being with most record labels that have been around for a long time, eventually they don't end up owning all the music they had originally released. 2 examples that come to mind is TheFatRat. I'm pretty sure they've since rescinded all of their releases on the Tasty Network. I imagine their relations are very amicable. There was no, fight or anything like that. But assuming their music contract had expired, they decided not to renew it. Another artist that I find pretty fun pointing out is that Nightpunk has actually released on the Tasty Network twice. It appears like those songs have since been removed on most platforms, but you guys can still listen to it on YouTube if you guys really wanted to. Sounds nothing like current day Nightpunk. Something that I've started doing recently as well with my marathons is actually writing down catalog codes. I think catalog codes are pretty fun because they can almost sometimes tell a story. A quick example that I'll give is that in 2024, the catalog codes would increment by 1, with the first release of the year being code TNS147, presumably being Tasty Network single 147. Fast forward to March, we have Zoi's Roller with TNS156, followed by Bad Disc's Do You Know Why I'm Here at TNS158. TNS157 is straight up missing. As for what reason, it could be a scrapped Tasty release. Alternatively, it could be a Tasty release that is currently in limbo. Who knows? Although a more interesting fact I find is that while it's not necessarily uncommon for labels to change catalog codes over the years, in its debut, the Tasty Network had 3 concurrent catalog code formats that they were maintaining. That being TNS with 3 numbers, TR with 3 numbers, probably Tasty Records, and then BLV with like 9 digits, which is probably like the ISRC code or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, which was maintained pretty consistently up until middle of 2017 and then completely phased out at the end of 2020. now opting for the TNS format. So that's pretty interesting. Now let's talk about the artist statistics. Starting off with featured artists, there have been 23 artists that have had feature credits, with Pink Noise having the most feature credits at 4, followed by Emily Underhill, Fernando Pipo, and Jessica Gabrielle at 2 feature credits. As for remixes and VIPs, we have had 28 artists, with the crown going to Michael with 5 remix credits. With that said, slightly skewed, they released a 4-track EP which were all VIPs and was also on the Dreams remix EP, which is how they got up to 5, followed up by Prototype Raptor and Falcon Funk at 2 remixes. As for albums, that being EPs and LPs, the winner goes to F.O.O.L, who has released 3 EPs over the course of Tasty's lifespan, followed by Rod's, Shurk, and Last Island that had 2 EPs. As for the number of tracks, the winner goes to F.O.O.L once again at a whopping 18 tracks, followed by Shurk at 15, Rod's at 12, Kashuk's also at 12, Last Island also at 12, and the Noisy Freaks at 11, with a more extended list somewhere on the screen. One of the things that I personally found most interesting is that the Noisy Freaks, who have not released a single song since 2014, is still, by the volume of music that they have produced, one of the titans of the Tasty Network. And while I think nobody would even think of them as a Tasty artist at this point, if I was to make a Mount Rushmore of Tasty artists, I think it would only be fair to have the Noisy Freaks somewhere on there. In a similar vein, however, when it comes down to pure appearances, the list remains rather unchanged. However, Rods and Shurk do flip, and F.O.O.L once again reigns supreme. F.O.O.L hasn't seen an appearance on the Tasty Network since, I believe, like 2018, but I would also find it to be completely fair to have them to be considered a titan of the Tasty Network as well. Also pretty interesting, I'd say, to see how consistent that F.O.O.L is as a project. When listening back to their 2012 stuff and then comparing it to some of the stuff that they release nowadays, it's basically the same style and the same sort of branding and ideology behind the music. It's just that the production quality has definitely improved since, a decade and a half ago. And as we reach the end of the video, we get to the final part of the video of me answering the question, would I recommend marathoning the Tasty Network? My answer is yes, but there is a very slight asterisk. Generally speaking, when people take up the challenge of marathoning a record label or putting it on their to-listen list of a bunch of music, I've always heard the debate of, listening through music in its entirety as a must, as opposed to skipping around in a song. Because of the point that I had mentioned earlier, where the Tasty Network, while it's only 332 songs, averages as a much longer discography compared to some of the others, I would say that it is a pretty fun project to commit to listen to the record label. But if you don't want to tire yourself out, or you're more of a casual listener, I would say that it'd probably be fair to skip around on some of the songs, or to skip a song if you find that, at the halfway point, you're not quite enjoying it. As I think I had mentioned earlier, the quality of the music on the Tasty Network is sort of like a U symbol. The first few years are pretty solid and definitely aged, and in the middle years, they definitely suffered a bit of a decline in quality when trying to substitute some of their house music for a larger variety of genres. I think it's really unfortunate that right on the end of 2018, I would say, is when the Tasty Network really found their stride and the quality of music was at its best. The reason for that is because starting from 2019, the amount of tracks that they had released was definitely a lot less. And then of course there is the aforementioned Twilight Zone into 2021. Going into 2024, there is a bit of a dip in quality, but I think it has very quickly kind of built itself back up. They're just trying to get themselves back on the right foot and on the ground running. And so far, their 2025, while they have only released 6 songs so far, I think are very strong songs. Definitely no bias because of Chronophyll, but also want to give a couple shoutouts to my fellow artists above and below us. That said, as I always do, if you find that you don't want to sit through the entire record label, I have put together a SoundCloud playlist of all of my personal favorite Tasty tracks that will continue to get updated as more songs continue to come out. Y'all can find a link in the description down below. Anyways, I'm done this video. Took me 1 whole week to record. Now I gotta edit it. I'll see y'all later. And Simulcats will see Tasty again. Hopefully. We'll see. Bye-bye.